Hello and welcome to something a little different, a review that isn't. Now, what I mean by that is Vallejo very recently got in touch and offered to send me along a set of their new Xpress paints, which if you've not come across them so far, it's hard to describe them without referring to Citadel's Contrast because they are a very similar one coat job done style of paint. I was, thrilled, and they just sent them along and said I could have some fun. Didn't ask for me to do a review, but I thought it would be kind of rude not to show you what they were like, since a few of you have asked. Now, first impressions of these are really good, and you'll see, what I've got spinning around in front of me here is a little basic, but I am just starting to play with these things. So, honestly, this is a few impressions from somebody just getting started. Same as with when I first looked at the contrast line, but my impressions of these are very good. So the very first thing that I want to show you is the first miniature I painted using just the Xpress line. This fella here is a 3D print from Victus Miniatures, and I'll make sure to pop a link to that in the description. And I did end up leaning slightly into the mid-90s X-Men color scheme because the vibrancy of the Xpress range is really quite impressive. Now, similarly to the first run of Contrast, there's a lot of very bright colors, some really rich oranges, reds, yellows, greens, and a couple of really pretty turquoise colors that I've actually, that's nice. Snake green, I think that one was, on his trousers, and I quite enjoyed using them. In particular, if we get a look at his cape here, you'll see the reason why I chose this miniature was that it has a little bit of some folds and creases, but a lot of quite flat areas. And the only real blip here, that was my mistake. That was where I actually put some of the Xpress on, wandered off, did something else, and then moved it and got this little tide mark. But that is something which is genuinely quite impressive about the Xpress range. It doesn't dry as quickly as Contrast does, so it gives you a lot more time to work with that effect. So if I had been a little more cautious with what I was doing, you wouldn't have that there. Everything you'll see, this is all one coat over a white primer. I did use white scar because I wanted a sort of fair comparison, and it's all Xpress colors. I didn't do any tidy up, so you will see one or two little blips where I've run over on the colors, but I am actually quite impressed. In particular, of all the things, I really like the white. Templar white is basically, it's like apothecary white, but where apothecary white has a bluish tint, the Templar white is a more neutral gray. So really handy there. I quite like that. Speaking of grays though, grays and beiges are two things that are missing presently from the range. Now, Vallejo have said already that they are working on a next release. They've promised that there are a bunch more colors coming and one or two that nobody else is doing yet. So those of you, myself included, who've been hanging out there for a contrast or an Xpress style field gray, maybe that's on the way. We'll see. But all in all, quite impressed. You'll see that the shading effect on this fella is fairly subtle. In part, that's because of the miniature. So I've got a couple of others that I'm now going to play around with and do some painting on screen. I'm not really going to finish these miniatures. I might do one of them, we'll see. But really I just want to show you the difference, if you're familiar with Contrast, how Xpress works differently to that. Now, just while I'm preparing to start painting with these, what I want to show you, this here is an old plate. Any shallow dish will do just fine. And I've got one of my little plastic pellets, which ordinarily I would use quite happily, but it's starting to warm up a little bit. Now, particularly if you are somewhere that it regularly gets really warm, the Xpress, same as Speedpaint, recommends that you don't use it with an actual wet pellet because the water will seep through and change the properties of what you're painting with. So you want to use a pellet. But especially on hot days, your paint's not going to last very long in these little wells without drying out. So we get a little bit of water in the bottom of an old dish and pop this on the top. Now with a little bit of water underneath, it helps keep these wells cool and your Xpress or your Speedpaint or whatever won't dry out as quickly on a warm day. So it's not a wet pellet, it's a wet pellet. Anyhow, that's what I'm going to be using for these today. So what I have here, this is Omega Blue, and you might recall that the Ultramarines chapter symbol is an inverted Omega. I'm sure that's just a coincidence though. So I'm going to load up my brush, and I'm going to use a nice fresh medium shade brush for this because I want a fair amount of it at a time. Let's flip them around and see how this goes on. You'll see, obviously applying it, it's not terribly different to contrast, but very quickly you can see that it does settle just a little bit differently. As well, I'm able to work with it and get some of these streaks off of the surface fairly quickly. Yeah, that's not looking too bad. I'm going to go around the whole model. Now you'll see that already the streaky surface of the center of this big smooth panel has already sort of evened out, and that's what I'm hoping to see all over the armor. So I'm going to cover most of this dude, and we'll come back in a couple of minutes, see what we've got once this dries. Now that will take a little bit longer than contrast to dry, but that's not too bad once it has. I was deliberately going really heavy on the legs to try and see if I could get it to pull deliberately, but it's handled that fairly well. You've still got the edge highlighting effect as the material has sort of shrunk as it dries, and except for this section here on the front of his leg, where I couldn't quite keep the brush moving in the same direction as I was applying it, that is a surprisingly smooth finish for one coat of this Xpress over a white primer. It's a little darker than I had expected, but I'm not unhappy with that. That's pretty cool. Now, traditionally, I would still suggest painting Ultramarines, you're going to be quicker to just spray it blue and then shade it. But for the demonstration of this going on power armor, yeah, man, that's pretty groovy. That's come out a lot better than I would have expected. You'll see, though, up on his face and a little bit on his gun too, I have splashed with a bit of the blue where I don't want it. So I've got here some white from the Army Painter. I like using this more than white scar for this sort of tidy up because it's got a slightly more smooth, resinous kind of finish once we're done. And I think that's going to help match the primer a little better. So as you can see, nice and easy to tidy up, and I'm not getting any bleed through. So, does it reactivate? No, it doesn't. You don't have to worry about that. Now, what I'm going to do now is throw on just a bit of velvet red onto the weapons, some nuclear yellow onto the chest eagle, and a little bit of dwarf skin on his face. Then what I'll do is pop on some metallics. I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel and a little bit of Known Oil, and just very quickly finish him off. Let's see what a quote-unquote finished Xpress Space Marine will look like. So with those last couple of details popped on and a very quick base done, that's not too bad. Obviously there's a few details missing if I was going to paint him as a proper Ultramarine, but for the purposes of flashing how that color turns out, I think that's actually really quite impressive. That red in particular, I love how that looks. But looking at the rest of the armor, you know, that's not a bad finish at all. That is one coat of that Omega Blue, and I'm quite pleased with that. So what I am going to do, because this is such a matte finish, I'm going to take him outside and hit him with a satin varnish spray. I'm interested to see if that will make him look a little bit more Space Marine. And there with the satin varnish, yeah, that looks a little nicer. I quite like that finish. As well, it is always a good idea, in fact necessary, to varnish whether you're using contrast, speed paint, or Xpress. They're not quite as hard wearing. They don't have the same sort of acrylic layer which will protect them from rubbing off. So whatever you do choose to use, make sure you are varnishing them. Alright, what I've got here, this is a 3D print. This is one of the Station Forge Grimguard, and she is going to be available, I believe, at the end of March, unless you're a member of their tribes, in which case, well, you've got her already like I do. I'm going to go ahead and paint this miniature using mostly the Xpress line. I want to see just how far I can get. As I said, there are one or two colors really missing, so I'm going to have to improvise what I might want to do with a couple of other colors. My impression of these so far is that they would be super easy to mix too. Not sure I quite want to do that yet. I probably want a little bit more time and practice with them to get a feel for that, but it is definitely an option. They're very easy to work with. Now, at the moment, everything we're looking at is just the Xpress, and this is also, I think, a really good look at the Black Lotus color, because as you see, it's not a true black. It's really more of a really deep bluish, greenish, like a petrol color, but it is lovely. I really like how that turns out. What I am going to do, though, because at the moment the green is a little much, it actually looks like the honor guard for the Wizard of Oz, and I reckon we can knock that back a bit. So what I am going to do is to put some metallic paint on her buttons and her las rifle. Then I'm going to use a little bit of the umber wash from Vallejo and see what happens then. Now there I've put the flesh wash over her skin, I've put black wash over the armor and the rifle. Everything else got the umber wash, and that's it. I can't believe what a huge difference that makes. Popping the base on, of course, helps a big deal, but the finish itself, man, that's cool. I might, in the future, thinking about it, thin the Xpress just a little while working with these larger areas. In part, I think that was a little bit of the primer had gone a bit funny while I was putting on, and I was just interested to see how the Xpress would deal with it. I'm still very happy with that result. So there at last, my thoughts on the Vallejo Xpress line. They're good. Upsides are definitely that they feel a little easier to use. They are nicer to apply than contrast. They're just a little bit more reliable in the results that you're going to get out of them, it feels like. The downside really is the size of the range. At the moment, there's 24 bottles, 23 of them are colors, and one of them is the medium. Now, I haven't experimented yet with playing around with the medium, so this is really just first impressions. But I think with that little Krieg lady standing in the front there, yeah, man, these have really got a good potential. Particularly those new colors that Vallejo said are coming along, I am looking forward to more. So thank you again to Vallejo for sending these along for me to have a play with. I've really enjoyed mucking around, and I think one or two of these are really going to make a big difference to how I paint things. Literally how I choose to paint things. As always, thanks very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you will enjoy the rest of your day.